Welcome to the University of Arkansas Vegetable Research Station in Kibler, Arkansas. My name is Stephen Eaton and I am the director of the station. We are happy to have you join us here today for our 5th virtual field trip in the Soil and Water Conservation Series funded by the NRCS and hosted by the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. We will get to see some of the research on cover crops and researchers graduate students are conducting here within the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. I want to introduce you to one of our researchers and extension specialists, Dr. Amanda McWhirt. Amanda, thanks for being here today.
Hey Steve. Thanks everyone. So my name is Dr. Amanda McWhirt. I'm a horticulture specialist with the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service, and I conduct research on cover crops and their impact on fruit and vegetable systems. And today we're going to tour some of my research and the research my colleagues are working on.
Can you tell us more about what we will be learning today?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. So today we hope to take you on a tour of some of the research being conducted here at the Vegetable Research Station on no-till watermelon production. We want to tell you a little bit about what we've been learning about how to be successful with cover crops in this type of production system.
That's great. Can you tell us a bit more about what it means to use cover crops in a no-till system?
Absolutely. So cover crops are crops that are planted in the off-season, not to be harvested and sold, but for the effects that they have on the soil or on improving the condition of the next cash crop. Some of the reasons to plant cover crops are to provide soil cover in the off-season, which helps to prevent soil erosion, to help suppress weeds, or to retain soil nutrients, or possibly to provide nutrients to the next cash crop, or as a means to provide crop rotation, which can help suppress diseases. In a no-till system, we grow the cover crop in the season before the cash crop, and then before planting the cash crop, the cover crop is rolled down to create a mat on the soil surface that acts as a weed barrier and helps to hold soil moisture. So part of the benefit of participating in a live virtual field trip is that you get to ask questions of our experts. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Steve, let's go ahead and jump in and meet our first presenter.
Okay.
Our first presenter is going to be Alden, and so we'll have him come on. Hi Alden, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks, happy to be here.
So Alden, today we are talking about winter cover crops, since watermelons are planted in the summer. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the common types of cover crops?
Sure. First thing, there are 3 major categories of cover crops. The first category is the legumes. This group is unique in that it can form a symbiotic relationship with certain soil bacteria and turn atmospheric nitrogen, which is not plant available, into a form such as ammonia that the legume plant can use to grow. When the legume plants die and decompose, the nitrogen is released and can then be utilized by the cash crop, in this case, watermelons. The next category is the grass cover crop. This is commonly used for many different reasons, like it's easy to grow and they are good at keeping soil from eroding due to their fibrous root systems. Grass cover crops can also be used for weed prevention, both because they can outcompete other weeds in the season, they are grown, and also through the release of chemicals that keep weeds from growing in the next season. This is called an allelopathic effect. The grasses also work well in a no-till system because they can produce a lot of biomass that creates a good mat and stops light from reaching the soil surface, which can also prevent weeds from growing. The final category is brassicas, like mustards and turnips that are planted typically because they are good at suppressing disease. If we plant a mixture of these categories of cover crops, we can get the benefits of all of them at the same time.
Alden, that's great info. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of the most common winter cover crops are from each of these categories that we often plant here in Arkansas?
Some cover crops that are commonly planted in the winter here in Arkansas and in other parts of the southeast are winter wheat, cereal rye, which are grasses, Austrian pea, crimson clover, which are legumes, and then mustards, which are brassicas. You may recognize some of these as cash crops, but when they are used as a cover crop, their management is a little different. As a cover crop, we want a lot of biomass production and no seed, so we typically plant them at a higher density and kill them early before they set seed.
Great. So can you tell us a little bit more about the characteristics of each of these different winter cover crops and why they might be planted?
Sure. Black oats is a grass. They are pretty low growing, but they create a dense canopy at the soil surface. They are slow to create a seed head in the spring. Winter wheat is cheaper to plant than other grasses. Slower growth in the spring allows a long window before termination. Like other grasses, it can be effectively scavenge nitrogen and other nutrients from the soil before they are lost. Cereal rye is the tallest growing of the winter cover crops we'll talk about today. It is easy to establish and can be planted pretty late into November, even when soil temperatures drop to below 40 degrees. To produce a lot of biomass, which is good in a no-till system and for weed control. Austrian pea is a vining legume. It will crawl up grasses if interplanted with them. It produces a lot of biomass for a legume and is a good nitrogen fixer. Crimson clover is also a legume. It is more low growing than peas and only gets about 12 inches tall. Mustards are brassicas and are planted because they can have disease-suppressing effects on soil. They are often poor competitors with weeds and need to be planted at a very shallow depth. They can sometimes be winter killed in the northern part of the state.
Alden, that's great to know the different characteristics of the cover crops. It's important to pick cover crops that fit both the goals you are trying to achieve from using them, but also that have characteristics that fit the cash crop production system. For example, in watermelons, a lot of growers use wheat or cereal rye as their winter cover crop because it is a high biomass producer, or it produces a lot of plant growth. And so that works really well to create a weed mat for the vines to run over in a no-till system. Alden, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're researching in your trial?
This project was developed to give Arkansas farmers more information on the use of cover crops in no-till watermelon production. As you mentioned, a common cover crop that is grown before watermelons currently is winter wheat. We developed this research project to see if planting a mix of cover crops, such as mixing a grass with a legume, might offer additional benefits like increased nitrogen additions to the watermelon crop. Here's a list of all the cover crop treatments we are evaluating. We are evaluating 6 different cover crop species in various mixtures. These species are black oats, cereal rye, wheat, Austrian pea, crimson clover, and mustard. You will notice we are planting all grasses individually and in combination with each legume. We also have one treatment that includes a grass, legume, and a mustard. We also wanted to look at how using cover crop mixes would work in a no-till watermelon production system. A typical method for growing watermelons is to till the soil and form raised beds that are covered in black plastic. This project is different in that it utilizes a no-till system without plastic mulch. This method involves minimal soil disruption and keeps the cover crops on the soil surface. Again, we are using a roller crimper to flatten the cover crop to make a good mat to suppress weeds, as seen in this video. This allows the watermelon vines to run over the mat and protect them from direct contact with the soil.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the timeline of when you're planting the cover crops and then following with the watermelon planting?
Planting cover crops can be done using several different methods, including with a planter or by broadcast. For this project, the cover crops were hand broadcast in September. The purpose of this was to see if a variety of cover crops could be effectively grown with minimal planting equipment. The cover crops are allowed to grow all winter, and then about 2 weeks before we are ready to plant, we use the roller crimper to flatten the cover crop. The roller crimper is pulled behind the tractor and snaps the stalks of the cover crops, creating a cover crop mat. To ensure the cover crops die down, we also applied glyphosate and waited about 2 weeks before transplanting our watermelons into the mat.
So some people might think that a September planting of cover crops seems early. Can you explain why you're planting during that time period?
In a no-till system, we want the cover crop to produce a lot of biomass so that when it is rolled down, there is a thick mat that will suppress the weeds well into the season. If we allow the cover crop as much time as possible in the fall to establish this, we can ensure that we get a good amount of biomass in the spring, even if we have to terminate early in April.
So in your study, can you tell us more about what you are monitoring within the cover crops and the watermelons?
We've been monitoring weeds in cover crop, the weeds in the field during the watermelon season, the nitrogen status of the watermelons, and the yields of the watermelons.
Alden, that's a lot of data collection. Tell us about how you test to see how the cover crops impact how much nitrogen the watermelon plants are taking up.
Prior to termination, the cover crops were tested for their nitrogen content. The differences between the legumes, the mixed treatments, and the grasses became very apparent. The grass cover crops did have some nitrogen content, which can be assumed to have been residual nitrogen from the previous season. But in comparison to the mixed or legume plots, the difference is stark. The grass plots average was just over 26 pounds per acre of nitrogen, while the mixed grass plus legume plots average was about 96 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And legume only plots average was over 135 pounds per acre of nitrogen. This shows that the legume plots produced over 5 times as much nitrogen than just the grass cover crop. The next slide shows the averages from each of our cover crop treatments and demonstrates some of the cover crop mixes can actually produce close to the same amount of nitrogen as some of the legume only treatments.
Great, so how did you monitor to see if the nitrogen in the cover crops moves into the watermelons?
We test the watermelon plant to see how much nitrogen they are taking up. In this video, you will see how we can collect plant petiole samples. Today we'll be taking field petiole nitrate samples in strawberries. This can actually be done in a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, as the principles are generally the same. When you get to a plant, what you'll want to do is find the most recently matured leaf and go to the base of the petiole, close to the bottom, snap off the leaf, and you're just left with the petiole. You'll want to do this throughout the field to get a good representation of the overall nitrate levels. And then once you have enough, about 15 or so in this case, we'll go back inside and take the actual readings. Now that we're back inside, we're going to go ahead and finish extracting all the sap out of the petioles. I've done most of them, but I'll do the last one to show you how we go about doing this. So you take your petiole, you put it in your garlic press, smash it down in there, and then press it down until the sap comes out. When you've collected all your sap, you go ahead and put it in this small meter. This is called a Cardi meter, and it reads your nitrate level in parts per million. So you pour it inside the little reservoir, close it down, and let it read. Eventually you'll get a number that actually reads in parts per million. From our results from doing these tests in all of our plots, we see a trend very closely tied to the trends we saw in how much nitrogen was in the cover crop. As expected, the watermelons grown in the grass cover crop plots were very low in nitrogen. In fact, lower than the recommended nitrate levels for that plant growth stage. In contrast, the watermelon plants of the mixed treatments and the legume treatments had much higher levels of nitrate. For the watermelons and the mixed treatments, the nitrate levels were all in the acceptable range. In the legume treatments, the watermelon plants had nitrate levels exceeding the required amount. The overall average of petiole nitrate of watermelon plants in legume treatment was nearly 8 times higher than the petiole nitrate content of plants grown in the grass treatment. This helps demonstrate the ability of the legume cover crops to help supplement fertilizer to the watermelon crop, and could mean the amount of chemical fertilizer applied could be reduced. This also shows how quickly the legume cover crops can break down and release available nitrogen for uptake as the watermelon vines grow.
We should mention that all plots got an equal amount of fertilizer injected through the drip irrigation each week according to standard fertility recommendations. Alden, what else have you noticed so far in your research as to how different winter cover crops are impacting other parts of the watermelon production system?
Another trend that we saw was the difference in watermelon maturity between different types of cover crops. 3 watermelon harvests were done during the season, each of them 1 week apart. In the first harvest, the legume plots had over half its fruit mature and ready to be picked. The mixed treatments had some ready, but still not even half. The grass cover crops were even further behind, with almost no fruits ready for harvest. By the second harvest, the legume plots were almost completely done being harvested. For the majority of the watermelons to mature in the mixed and grass treatments, it took 1 more additional week. While many watermelons matured earlier in the mixed treatments, the third harvest was required to get the majority of the watermelons ready for harvest. The grass treatment watermelons were even further behind, with almost no watermelons ready for harvest until the final week. We hypothesized that the extra nitrogen supplied by the legume cover crop plots helped to speed up the maturity of the watermelon vines.
Wow, that's a really important observation. Growers like to have their watermelons earlier in the season rather than later. But what did you observe about yields?
When comparing the average total pounds of marketable watermelons grown, the legumes came out on top again, followed very closely by the mixed plots. An average legume treatments averaged more than double the pounds of production compared to the grass-only cover crop plots. This once again may be attributed to more plant-available nitrogen in the legume plots. However, a few of the mixed cover crop plot treatments, specifically cereal rye and Austrian pea, and black oats and crimson clover, were the highest yielding overall. The ability of the cover crops to reduce weeds was also measured in the growing season. Close to watermelon maturity, a sample of weeds were taken from each plot, dried, and weighed. Major problem weeds in this field were Palmer amaranth, goosegrass, and yellow nutsedge. As expected, the legumes did very poorly in reducing weed growth compared to the other treatments. The mixed treatments averaged less than half as much weed growth compared to the legumes, but still had more than double the amount of weed biomass compared to the grass cover crops. This demonstrates the ability of the grass cover crops to reduce weed growth well into the watermelon season. This also shows that while grasses in the mixed treatments can still contribute to weed suppression, the mixes do not suppress weeds on average as well as grass-only cover crop plots.
That's great, Alden. From the initial year of data, do you have any observations or initial recommendations to our watermelon growers here in Arkansas?
From 1 year of this research trial, some basic trends have become apparent. The start of being successful with no-till watermelons is getting a quality stand of cover crops in the fall. This is essential to be able to utilize a roller crimper and create a long-lasting cover crop mat that will remain long into the watermelon growing season. Another lesson we learned is that heavy weed pressure in a field may still require a herbicide to keep weeds from competing with the watermelon plants. When comparing the cover crop treatments, we have seen the benefit of mixing a legume with a grass cover crop for good weed control and an added benefit of nitrogen fixation. Some recommended cover crop mixes that may work well for watermelons are cereal rye mixed with Austrian pea or black oats mixed with crimson clover. Both of these were high yielding and provided relatively good weed control. This study is in its second year, so look for more results to come soon.
Thanks so much, Alden. That's great to know how different cover crop mixes might have different impacts on weed control, while others seem to be having a bigger impact on yield or on nitrogen uptake. We hope that these results will aid growers in choosing what cover crops to plant. Alden, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks.
Just a reminder, please use that Q&A chat box to submit your questions. We will answer some of your questions live during our Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So in Alden's trial, we really only looked at how cover crop mixes could suppress weeds and didn't look at how different herbicides could be used in conjunction with cover crops to improve weed control. But luckily we have Dr. Matt Bertucci here to share some details on some work we are conducting also here at the Vegetable Station in Kibler. Dr. Bertucci is a research weed scientist, and we are working on some additional cover crop research in watermelon. Matt, thanks so much for joining us here today. I'm going to pass it off to you and let you tell us a little bit more about this trial.
Absolutely. As Alden described, cover crops can be used to generate a physical barrier to prevent weeds from emerging within watermelon fields. And that is a great start. Anytime you can create a competitive advantage for your crop relative to weeds, like when you use a cover crop, that's referred to as cultural control. But we have to remember all of the components of integrated weed management. And you'll see those listed on the slide here. In addition to cultural control, other components include physical or mechanical control, such as tillage or hand weeding, biological control, which would be the introduction of natural enemies that prey on weed species, and chemical control, which for weeds would include the use of herbicides. Mechanical control can effectively kill small weeds, but may be undesirable because repeated tillage will destroy soil structure and ultimately reduce organic matter. And you can see that in these slides here. Another issue is that tillage is no longer an option when watermelon vines reach to row middles, which may be as soon as 3 to 4 weeks after transplanting. Obviously, it would be impossible to till without damaging these watermelon vines that have extended into the row middles. Fortunately, cover crops may prevent the need for tillage. As we've mentioned, cereal rye is sown in the fall, and you can see that in the slide here. And it will germinate and then protect the soil over the winter. But if tillage can be avoided in a no-till system, then a cereal rye cover crop will also protect that soil in the summer as watermelon are planted and grown throughout the season. Now, the last component of integrated weed management is chemical control. As with many horticultural crops, the number of registered herbicides for watermelon is extremely limited. Most of the available herbicides must be applied as pre-emergent applications to prevent the emergence of weeds within the season. Some post-emergence products are available to kill grass species, like clethodim under the trade name Select or Sethoxydim as Post. But other products to control emerged broadleaf weeds will require shielded sprayers or some sort of directed spray to avoid injuring the crop. So when it comes to chemical weed control in watermelons, our best option is the use of pre-emergent herbicides with long residual activity. So now that we know all of the components of integrated weed management, let's take a moment to consider them relative to the crop we are discussing today. Watermelon is a long season summer crop. It can take over 90 days from seeding to harvest, and that is a really long time to try and keep a field free of weeds. When weeds emerge, they can quickly grow taller than that prostrate growing watermelon vine, and they're going to compete with the crop for light, water, and nutrients. This ultimately results in reduced yields, reduced fruit number, and reduced net profitability for growers. And that is what we want to avoid, as you see in this slide here, when weeds take over your fields. But as Alden mentioned in his presentation, we have observed that cover crops alone, especially depending on cover crop mixes, are not sufficient to prevent weed emergence throughout the season. And that led us to execute this study, which was designed to evaluate performance of several pre-emergent herbicides in a cereal rye cover crop system and in a bare ground system. Integrated weed management incorporates multiple strategies for weed control, and this experiment tests the potential benefits of using herbicides in combination with the cereal rye cover crop rather than using either strategy on its own. A comparison of each method, that is bare ground versus cover crop, will allow us to evaluate the utility of pre-emergent herbicides in each respective system, and it will allow us to compare the utility of the cover crop itself. Now this study was laid out as a split plot design, which means that sections of the field were drill seeded with a cereal rye cover crop or were left fallow over the winter. Then, in the spring, we came back and applied our herbicide treatments within each of the strips. Now on this slide you can see each grid cell pictured received a different herbicide treatment, and the herbicide treatments included S-metolachlor, which is under the trade name Dual Magnum, Famecifin, or Reflex, or clomazone plus ethylfluoralin as strategy, and an untreated check which received no herbicide. The herbicides were applied at the beginning of the season just prior to watermelon transplanting, and to assess weed control, we rated plots visually for total weed coverage at weekly intervals. Additionally, we counted weed species within a fixed area of each plot and harvested weed biomass to quantify how many weeds were present and how large weeds grew in response to our treatments. At the end of the season, we harvested all watermelon in a single harvest, grading to marketable or unmarketable based on fruit size. Then we compared which treatments produced greatest total yields and greatest fruit numbers. The results of our first year revealed that a cereal rye cover crop was extremely effective for suppressing weeds in watermelon production. The biomass of the flattened cereal rye was thick enough to prevent weed emergence around the watermelon vines throughout the entire season. At 2 weeks after application, visual ratings indicated that Dual Magnum and Reflex exhibited fair to good control in bare ground plots. And this can be seen in the slide where bare ground plots have small weed populations where more of that soil is visible. That means the herbicide's working. More impressive was that there were no weeds visible in plots containing cereal rye. When we fast forward to 6 weeks after application, many of the pre-emergence herbicides were no longer providing acceptable levels of weed control. You can see that emerged weeds have begun to overtake watermelon plots, towering over those prostrate watermelon vines. However, the cereal rye cover crop persisted and prevented late season weed infestations. The level of control was so high in cereal rye plots that no effect of herbicide was observable. In fact, cereal rye plots receiving no herbicides, the control plots, looked similar to each of the plots receiving the herbicides, Dual Magnum, Reflex, or Strategy. Of course, weeds emerged within those bare ground strips, and we were able to assess relative herbicide performance within those plots. Of the included treatments, S-metolachlor offered the greatest level of control, though weeds had emerged by a season's end. Reflex and Strategy provided unacceptable levels of weed control, indicating that pre-emergent herbicides alone are not sufficient for season-long weed control. When we translate that to yield and fruit count, we observe a highly significant effect of cover crop on watermelon yields and fruit counts. Now let's take a moment to orient ourselves to these two figures. On the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, is the fruit count per acre or yield per acre. The x-axis and the color of bars indicates the cover crop treatment. White represents bare ground plots, and red represents cereal rye cover crop plots. Each graph is divided into marketable or total. Marketable fruit were considered as all fruit weighing greater than 9 pounds, and total fruit count or total yield included all watermelon harvested from the plots. Looking first at the fruit count, we can see that the bare ground plots produced far fewer fruit per acre than the cover crop plots. The discrepancy is even larger when we consider only marketable fruit. This suggests that weeds in bare ground plots reduced fruit number and reduced average fruit size, ultimately below a threshold that we would deem marketable. On the right side, the data are very similar. The marketable yields and total yields are much lower in the bare ground plots than in the cereal rye plots. The cereal rye cover crop exhibited fantastic weed suppression in our first season. We observed increased weed control based on visual ratings, reduced weed populations based on our weed counts, and smaller weeds, when present, based on biomass sampling. The weed suppression by the cereal rye cover crop was so thorough that we were unable to detect herbicide effects within those plots. Instead, we had to simply compare the yield and weed control ratings to the cereal rye cover crop plots to those of the bare ground plots. However, we always want to confirm our results by replicating in multiple years or locations. There may be different weed species, soil types, or environmental conditions that affect the performance. We are currently repeating this trial and have already observed the variability in cover crop establishment. We are excited about these promising results in the first year and hope to report our findings from the 2020 trial sometime in the fall.
That's some great info, Matt. Weed control in specialty crops can be tricky, particularly in watermelon, as you mentioned, due to the lack of products labeled for use. So using multiple tactics makes sense. And it's great to see how well the cover crop mat in that scenario helped to suppress weeds. We're really looking forward to this season's results. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A chat box to submit those questions there at the bottom of your screen. I know another concern people sometimes have is that in no-till system where the cover crop is left in the field and the next cash crop is planted into that cover crop, that the cover crop will be a host to pest insects and will act as a bridge for the pest insects to pass from one season into the next. Luckily, we have Dr. Aaron Cato here to help us answer some questions related to pests.
Thanks, Amanda. My name is Aaron Cato, and I'm the Extension IPM Specialist for Vegetables and Fruits at the University of Arkansas. Previous speakers outlined a multitude of benefits that can be attributed to cover crops in watermelon production, and potential benefits also exist for insect management and support of insect ecosystems. These benefits include resources for insects and a reduced amount of disruption to life cycles of the naturally present insect species. In general, you can expect increased resources for beneficial insects, which can support pollinators or natural enemies of pest species. These resources should lead to increased biological control from natural enemies or to more effective pollination. Additionally, less disruption in insect life cycles could also lead to an increase in diversity of species of beneficial insects, which has been shown to lead to their success in pollinating and pest suppression. There is also potential risk incurred by using cover crops, which you may have learned referred to as the green bridge, or where pest insect species move from a dying cover crop to freshly planted or emerging plants to feed. Insects will search locally for green plant material to feed on when their preferred food is dying due to an herbicide application, which could mean feeding on young watermelon plants. This is the main risk that should be attributed to cover crops when considering insect management in watermelons. These cover crops can potentially provide refuge and resources for pest species, which could then act as a bridge to susceptible watermelon transplants. Other negatives are related to this green bridge potential, where additional time must be spent scouting cover crops to make sure no pest species are present in high numbers before transplanting. Additionally, if pest species are present in high enough numbers, an insecticide application will have to be made, which will negate the positives of cover crops because natural enemies and pollinators will be lost after this application and also will lead to increased cost and pesticide use. Research has been performed at the University of Arkansas to determine benefits and risk in a cover cropping system for watermelons. Results from these studies did not show increased pest numbers for cover crops on average, but the risk was still present. These studies did indicate a large assembly of beneficial insects that were present in cover crops, which could support increased predation and increased parasitism later in the watermelon growing season. This research shows the importance of scouting and possible management to avoid potential risk, but it serves as better as a reminder to avoid using an insecticide unless absolutely necessary, to preserve beneficial insects that will help mitigating risk later in the growing season. Let's now talk about how you can successfully manage insects in cover crops to maximize benefits and limit risk. First, determine which insect pest species pose the most risk. For watermelons, we need to scout our cover crop for spotted and striped cucumber beetles, squash bugs, and melon aphids, which are shown here in the slides presented. We need to scout cover crops prior to using a roller crimper or an herbicide application. When scouting, we need to first visually observe the cover crop to determine aphid numbers. Look on stems, under leaves, and in areas of new growth. Visual observations are important before sweeping takes place. Here we can see pea aphids on the stem of a legume and mustard aphid on the flowering structures of mustard. These aphids do not feed on watermelon, which shows the importance of observing and identifying the insects present. Just considering aphids alone will not tell you the entire story. You need to look for their natural enemies as well. These include lady beetles, lacewings, and aphid mummies caused by parasitic wasps. When these species are in abundance, aphids are unlikely to cause issues. Pictured on the bottom right is a green lacewing adult likely attracted to the mustard plants because of the aphids that are present. After performing a visual observation, use a sweep net with a 15-inch hoop and take 10 side-to-side sweeps. Be sure that the hoop passes through the cover crop where you would expect the insects to be, which would be areas with flowers, fruit, seed heads, or large amounts of foliage. This area may vary for legumes or grasses, but in general, you want your sweep net to be traveling through leaves or reproductive parts as much as possible. Additionally, make sure the hoop is angled backward, as shown in these pictures, so insects don't fall out of the net. Take a few 10 sweep samples in the cover crop as being shown in this video. Keep a quick pace so insects don't flee before your net passes through. Make sure to not sweep the same area twice, which means taking longer strides or multiple steps between each sweep. In the second video, notice how the sweeper targets the fruiting portions of the plant and how it is more difficult than the grass cover crop alone. Try to think about where pests have historically been on the farm, potentially in the cover crop, by the tree lines, or other forms of refuge near the edge of fields. After each 10 sweep sample, look through the contents of the sweep net for insects that were captured. Be aware that some insects can fly out very quickly. Slowly open the sweep net and observe what crawls or flies out. On this slide, you can see a variety of insects that were captured when we sampled Alden's cover crop work. Only the spotted cucumber beetle is known to be a significant pest of watermelon. All other insects pictured here are either predators, such as the damsel bug, or insects that don't feed on watermelon. These non-pest species do a great job of attracting predators and parasitoids to your fields, which could help mitigate issues after watermelon is transplanted. Insecticides are necessary when finding 1 or more squash bugs on 10 sweeps, or a large number of cucumber beetles at 2 to 3 per sweep, or around 20 to 30 per 10 sweeps. We only observed about 1 to 2 cucumber beetles per 10 sweeps in Alden's plotch, which means no insecticide would be necessary. Melon aphids are not likely to be an issue coming out of a cover crop, so get aphids identified before you spray based on observation. Squash bugs are the most serious issue that you could see early, as they are hard to control and get worse as the year goes on. However, it's very unlikely to find squash bugs that early in the spring. If necessary, insecticide applications should occur with the herbicide application before you use your roller crimper. Scouting should then take place just before watermelons are transplanted. It's possible that the insecticide did not work due to a multitude of potential issues, and this should be determined before susceptible transplants are added to the field. There may also be increased risk for insect pests to colonize after transplants occur if an insecticide was used, as they will remove all natural enemies that were present. Consider a drip application of a residual insecticide at planting if you have historically high early season insect pest populations for that field. Remember that not making an insecticide application will help promote beneficial insects and potentially help your watermelon crop succeed. Only make insecticide applications if scouting shows that pests are present at appreciable levels. In general, it's unlikely that an insecticide application will be necessary, and scouting will be the key component in successfully managing insects in a cover cropping system.
Aaron, thanks so much for that great info. It's really important to be aware of how to scout for pests in no-till systems, to identify any potential problems before planting, and then to think about what you might need to do if you do identify any potential pest issues.
Well, everyone, we want to thank you for joining us today in Kibler, Arkansas for the Soil and Water Conservation Virtual Field Trip.
This broadcast is funded by NRCS and produced by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture and Cooperative Extension Service. We hope you enjoyed getting to see some of the research we are conducting, and hopefully you got some new ideas about how you can use winter cover crops in no-till watermelon production. To find out more about the Soil and Water Conservation virtual field trips, please visit uaex.edu. We are now getting ready to start our Q&A segment of our live broadcast. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We're going to invite all of our speakers back to answer any questions that our audience might have.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at our virtual field trip. You may have noticed that we're doing things just a little bit differently today, and that's due to some of the extenuating circumstances that we have going on in the world. But we hope that this was still a nice tour of our research station and our research plots, and hopefully you got to see some of these things kind of up close and personal, even through this virtual format. We are going to start our live Q&A, and we do have all of our panelists and presenters here ready to answer your questions. And so go ahead, if you haven't already entered your questions, into that Q&A chat box there at the bottom of the screen, and we will try and get to as many of those questions as we are able. So it looks like our first question is for Dr. Matt Bertuzzi. Matt, the question is with regards to, will a cover crop work well for suppressing all types of weeds?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So unfortunately, the cover crops will not work equally against all different weed species. There's some variability in how these weeds behave and how they emerge. As Alden mentioned in his presentation, where there's bare spots in the soil, grass weeds tend to come up nicely through some of your cover crops. But really the big problem with, even with a dense, heavy biomass, there are perennial weeds that grow from rhizomes that can emerge from deep in the soil. I'm thinking particularly of the purple or yellow nutsedge species, and maybe some other weeds that can be problems with specialty crops like horse nettle. They can really emerge readily through some cover crops. Really the best weed suppression or weed control that you're going to get with a cover cropping system is suppression of summer annual weeds that emerge every year from seed.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. And the next question is kind of a follow-up for Alden. Alden, in your specific system, you're looking at different mixes of cover crops. Can you talk a little bit about the types of weed pressure that you've seen in your plots?
Sure. So the main weeds that we had as far as weed pressure that became problematic was the grasses. So in particular, goosegrass and a little bit of barnyard grass. And as Dr. Bertucci was saying, some of the annual weeds were actually suppressed quite well. Pigweed, for example, was suppressed well. But the other issue was the nutsedge, as Dr. Bertucci referenced.
Great, thanks so much for that, Alden.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to have a question for Dr. Aaron Cato. So Aaron, you did a great job of really demonstrating how to scout a field. Can you give us a little bit more information with regards to how much of the field needs to be scouted or how to go about doing that scouting?
Sure, Amanda. Typically when we talk about scouting a field, we really want to think about where problems have historically occurred in that field. A lot of times you'll think near tree lines or ditches, anywhere that insects will move into the field from points of refuge. Those are good spots to start, but what I would always recommend is trying to make either a W or a V type shape or movement through the field. You want to bring your sweep net with you, maybe bring in some little plastic baggies to take samples of insects in case you want to get them identified. And then as you go across that V or W shape, you want to take 10 sweep samples, just a few as you go along, and also do visual samples of maybe the aphid that could potentially be present. And so just going across the field in that kind of shape is going to be the best way to get a representative sample.
Great, thanks so much for that info, Aaron. Moving into this kind of system where you're adopting cover crops in a no-till type production system, scouting is going to be really key to success. So it's great to have your expertise on that. And then let's go to Steve really quick. Steve is the director of the Vegetable Research Station in Kibler. Steve, we have a question about what is the soil type at the research station. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. The soil type for these two tests is a Roxana silt loam. It is a very fine sandy soil or sandy loam type, and it's about 2 to 3 feet deep, and it is well drained and very good for vegetable production.
Great, thanks so much for that, Steve. We think that these trials are pretty well representative of the soil types that a lot of our watermelon growers in the state and in the region are also growing their watermelons on, so that this is a nice demonstration of that. We've had a couple of questions come in into the Q&A asking about the use of a burn down herbicide and specifically why we're using glyphosate as a part of our method for terminating a cover crop before transplanting. And so I want to address this issue just a little bit, and I'll put my 2 cents in, and then we'll open it up and see if Dr. Bertucci or Alden or anyone else has some comments as well. So this is a great question. So we are using the roller crimper in conjunction with glyphosate in order to kill and terminate our cover crop and make sure that we have that nice flat biomass on top of the soil surface before we go in and transplant. Now, of course, if you were in an organic production system, you would not be able to use that burn down herbicide. And you'd have to be really careful about making sure that the timing of when you were going in and using only the roller crimper to terminate that cover crop was adequate. And one of the reasons I want to say this is because we have observed, particularly in Alden's trials, where we're looking at all these different cover crop mixes, that the roller crimper works really well in some of our early trials to terminate certain cover crops, and it doesn't work very well to terminate other cover crops just by itself. And so this goes back to thinking about what species of cover crop are you using, and then kind of what is the timing of when are you going to try and terminate this cover crop in order to plant your other cover crop. So typically roller crimpers are going to work best by themselves if you're trying to roller crimp a cover crop right when it's starting to flower, but before it starts to set seed. That's generally, for most cover crops, when they're going to be most susceptible to being killed by a roller crimping. But again, certain cover crops are going to be more easily killed by a roller crimper than others. So things like really tall grasses like our cereal rye, we tend to get a better kill with the roller crimper versus just trying to kill out a crimson clover cover crop. It's very low growing, the stems are very soft. When you take that roller crimper across it, you don't really get the snapping and the bending of the plant biomass, and you don't get as good of a kill. So those are just some characteristics of the different cover crop and the timing that you might want to think about if you're going to attempt to do a no-till system and not use a burn down herbicide. Another thing that you might want to think about, especially if we start thinking about comparing our different grass cover crops, is that typically, for watermelons, we want to put those watermelons out into the field sometime in late April, early May. And the reason that we want to do that is so that we make sure that our watermelons are producing and are going to be harvested during the correct time period when people are wanting to buy watermelons. So typically, midsummer. And so when we go out and look at our cover crops, typically in that time period, the middle of April, our cereal rye has started to head out and is starting to flower. And so it's ready and going to be easily killed by that roller crimper. Versus our black oats is usually still very low growing. It hasn't started to make any type of seed head or flower. And so it's not going to be easily killed by just a roller crimper. And so in a watermelon specific system, cereal rye would probably work better if you're just trying to use the roller crimper without a herbicide. Austrian pea is another example of a legume that's usually flowering by that time, and will, when combined with that cereal rye, will be killed easily. So those are just some things that you might want to think about kind of surrounding that question of why we're using a herbicide. Of course, this research specifically is not focused on organic, but a lot of these practices could be incorporated into organic production. But you just need to be aware of kind of that timing issue going along with you using just a roller crimper. Dr. Bertuzzi or Alden, any other comments relating to that question?
Yeah, I have one more thought, was just to comment, like you said, about getting the complete kill. Of course, that herbicide enhances the kill down and the desiccation of the plant tissue. But I just wanted to point out that we don't just take these things for granted, that we actually have initiated some research this season looking at cereal rye termination, both with with the roller crimper alone or roller crimped in combination with glyphosate. So we can look and evaluate whether there is the added advantage, and we have two different timings. So it may be that we find a particular timing or a particular crimping that works better where the glyphosate may not be necessary. So we are investigating that further, and I just wanted to make sure. I appreciate the questions, because a lot of times the questions that you ask us guide the research that we then put out in the field.
Yeah, that's a great follow-up. Thanks so much, Matt, and stay tuned for that, what comes out of that future research. Of course, we want to make sure that we have a good kill of that cover crop, and that's why we're really focusing on all of these timings. You don't want that cover crop to become a weed in your next cash crop. All right, Erin, it looks like we have another question for you. And this question revolves around, if we do find some pest insects in our cover crop, things like cucumber beetles or squash bugs, what would you recommend for how to try and handle those pests if they're found?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. And one thing I want to note is that, a lot of what we're talking about here is Arkansas centric. And so really think about, I know I saw from some of the questions that people are from other parts of the country. So whenever I talk about certain pests that we deal with, think about what you normally have as an issue in your field. And those are the pests that you may see earlier on if you did have an issue from that cover crop. So always think about what you deal with specifically. And on the same vein, we're talking about recommended products. I'm going to recommend some for Arkansas for cucumber beetles or squash bugs early, but realize you do need to check to see if it's labeled in your state. And so for cucumber beetles and squash bugs, things like the pyrethroids are a good kind of like a one-shot. It also would control things like cutworms, which we have seen a little bit in some of the cover crops. So that would be things like Brigade or Mustang Max. Another really good option for people who have a lot of higher early season pest pressure, which just depends on where you're at in the country and the state, and then even in a county level, would be Admire Pro, and you can apply that either as a drench or through the drip line. And so that usually gives you about 3 to 4 weeks of protection from both cucumber beetles and squash bugs. So it's very good to get it out early, especially when you're targeting cucumber beetles, right when you are going to be transplanting your plant. So it gives you good protection then.
Great, thanks so much for that, Aaron. We have another question coming in about the use of a raised bed with cover crops. And the idea of, would it be difficult to roll or crimp the cover crop if you still have a raised bed underneath? This is a really great question. There's actually some work that has been done, I believe in Auburn, looking at specific roller crimpers that are shaped for roller crimping on raised beds. And so some of that work has been looked into with trying to still get some of the advantages of having a raised bed in combination with using no-till watermelons. We haven't looked at that specifically here in Arkansas, but that type of machinery does exist. Another question coming through is any known allelopathic or negative effects on watermelon with any of the cover crop species? Alden, would you like to comment on this? Have we noticed any allelopathic effects from any of the cover crops that we've been growing in conjunction with our watermelons?
So as far as the allelopathic effects, I guess most notable would be that it does suppress some of the weeds, even long-term into the season. So the black oats, the winter wheat did well, keeping the weeds down, even well into the growing season. As far as the allelopathic effect that might be negative towards the watermelons, it's hard to say whether or not it's the allelopathic effect or the lack of additional nitrogen that the legumes did comparatively. However, when you do look at the yields, the grass cover crops did have lower yields than the legumes or the mixes of the cover crops. So,
great, thanks so much, Alden.
You're welcome.
And then one more question for Dr. Bertuzzi. Matt, we have a question about the use of herbicides applied to cover crop rather than bare ground, and if there is any differences in efficacy. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, okay, so that's a really smart question, because obviously when you have that thick biomass, you have a lot of organic matter from that cover crop, and bare ground doesn't have that organic matter at the soil surface. Instead, you just have the soil itself. And so there's the potential that herbicides get tied up in the organic matter of the cover crop and don't actually reach the soil surface where they would be effective for suppressing weed emergence. And so there's been some concerns or expressed concerns about whether or not that would affect weeds that are coming up through the cover crop. And what we've observed, and what I think is the best way to take this on, is knowing that when you spray herbicides across a cover crop, ideally there would be gaps. Where there are gaps in that cover crop, it's still reaching the soil. So the residual herbicides are reaching the soil and suppressing weeds where you might not have had uniform growth of your cover crop. Obviously in the bare ground, you need broadcast coverage wall to wall to make sure that weeds don't emerge. But in the case of a cover cropping system, it's kind of covering your gaps where, for whatever reason, the seed germination wasn't uniform, or the soil fertility, or a low spot potentially. That's where the herbicides might be suppressing weeds where the cover crop wasn't present in the same density. So there is some differences, and my anticipation is that the synergistic effect would give you the highest levels of weed control. The real investigation then is whether it suits your production system. Again, whether it's organic, whether the herbicides are in your budget. So that would basically be it. The idea that the herbicide is covering where you might not have the ideal organic matter production from your cover crop.
Great, thanks so much for that, Matt. And then we have another question coming in that I'm gonna refer to Alden first, but then Dr. Cato may want to chime in as well. It's kind of a two-part question. So the first part is do you crimp only the areas to be planted and not the row metals, or do you crimp everything? And then what is the time frame of when you want to kill the cover crop before planting? Do you want to terminate the day before, or a week or 2 weeks before? Alden, would you? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So as far as crimping, we approach this as a manner in which the cover crops could have an additional purpose. Where we are growing is in the river bottom, so there's very little trees around, so the winds are can be quite high, the wind speeds, as well as Steve Eaton said, we're a very sandy soil. So especially during early season when the transplants are first put out, the high wind speed mixed with sand can really do some damage to newly transplanted watermelons. And even later in the season too, you get some sand blasting. So we actually roller crimp down the center of the cover crop and leave the sides standing to act kind of as a wind barrier, and in hopes that it would help protect the new transplants. As far as the timing, you want to give plenty of time for the cover crops to fully die before transplanting, and that also gives you more opportunity in case your first application of glyphosate didn't kill the cover crop completely. You can still go in and apply more if you have to, and make sure that you have a completely terminated cover crop before planting your watermelons.
Yeah, so in our trials, we are allowing about 2 weeks between termination before we transplant. And so that's the system that we've been using, though I know some growers will try other systems and may try and shorten that time period. Aaron, do you want to comment at all about the timing of termination before transplanting?
Yeah, Amanda, I think that it's kind of a tricky situation. It'd be hard to tell someone what they could do versus someone else. I think that often what you would find is that it's going to be different for every grower. So the idea is, Alden already mentioned, being able to be sure that you can kill it. So that's like one of the biggest factors. But for insects, they're looking for green plant material to feed on it. So what's happening is insects are already present in your cover crop. Once you kill it, then they're going to look immediately close to them for other green material. So that's your green bridge. Extending the time period between when you kill the cover crop and when you actually transplant your watermelons is going to reduce the risk of them moving over to watermelons. But for some people, they don't have very high pest pressure, so this isn't actually much of an issue. What I would recommend is if you did go very immediately, so maybe you terminated the cover crop and then maybe transplanted like almost the next day, this is a situation where your risk is going to be much higher. So this may be somewhere where you want to consider, using an insecticide, maybe one that's not as broad spectrum, in case, or at least, or at the very least, do a lot of scouting and make sure you're not in an area that you have high pest pressure, especially with things like cutworms and cucumber beetles specifically.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. We had a follow-up question about the use of raised beds. We are not using raised beds in our trials. So the soil is completely level when we go in and plant our cover crop in the fall. Then we come through, we're just using a standard roller crimper. And so there is no raised bed in our trial. All right, it looks like we are coming up on the end of the hour. And so we're gonna stop our question and answer session here. If there are any questions that we weren't able to get to, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. We wanna thank you all for joining us here today for our virtual field tour of no-till watermelon research. We look forward to seeing you again in the future at a future virtual field tour. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you for joining us for the Soil and Water Conservation Virtual Field Trip. This broadcast is funded by NRCS and produced by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture Cooperative Extension Service. To find out more about soil and water conservation, visit uaex.edu.